So again, lactic acid builds up due to the fact that there's no oxygen. The next thing that you'd want to understand is that this process goes away once oxygen comes back into the picture. So once you take like a drink of water, obviously because it's H2O, it has oxygen, as well as just taking a rest for a few seconds to catch your breath, you'll create ATP a little bit more efficiently, as well as eating prior to exercise, for instance. The other thing that you really need to know is that, yeah, that too. But hypoglycemics, for instance, because you're not having enough sugar, your ATP goes down and you get brain failure. The reason why you get brain failure is due to the fact that your brain only accepts glucose as an energy source. Your blood, however, is the highest per cell by cell intake contributor to glucose uptake. So if there's hardly any glucose in your bloodstream, there's not enough oxygen in your bloodstream, your brain is not really going anywhere. So that's where hypoglycemia comes in. The response is obviously giving a hypoglycemic glucagon IV and epinephrine to raise the blood sugar. Okay, enough of that stuff. So for diffusion, to go over that fairly quickly, since the mitochondria has DNA in and of itself, due to its long history of just being a prokaryote, it can have small receptors on its membranes as well. That's why it has an inner and an outer membrane, inner matrix. Get it? So diffusion ideally goes from an area that has lots of solute to areas with very little solute. It's normal diffusion. What builds up here in osmosis is osmotic pressure. Because even though this is a passive transport of molecules, this is usually done with water. Water is a very polar molecule due to hydrogen bonding in chapter 2. So that's where that comes from. Active transport is, as they say, is an uphill battle. So it's going from very little to it's a very big party in here very quickly. So there's a lot of solute. Facilitation occurs when ATP is required and when proteins are required. And it all ties back again to receptors and proteins in the cell membrane, for instance, when the cell is taking things in versus when it's pushing things out. Excuse me. Okay, moving on. So, for microfilaments and microtubules, they're kind of what holds the cell structure. So you can think of them like train tracks. You can think of them as blobs that are held together by magical forces. Whatever you feel comfortable with. But this is going to be a nice segue into tissues and skin. So because of the factor that microtubules and microfilaments usually are continuous, meaning that they keep going and going and going for a while. They build a nice structure for the cell membrane, for the cell, for organelles, and for your skin. So we'll move right along into epithelial cells. So epithelial cells, for instance, have much more structure associated to them than, say, a blood cell. I lie. But on par, they're both pretty much avascular, meaning that they don't have vasculature in and of themselves. They do not have nerve endings in and of themselves. However, they cooperate with blood vessels, they cooperate with neighboring organs, things like that. So avascular. To get energy, so to get their glucose. Epithelial cells are a little different because they don't really need as much sugar to survive. That's why, when you wake up in the morning, some of the epithelial cells on your skin are gone. So that's one point. Another point is for protection. So the microtubules and microfilaments also protect the cell during cell division. But they also are the structure for epithelial cells. So they also help when the skin is torn. They also help when the skin has to repair itself through mitotic cell division because it's more somatic than it is sex cell. So makes a lot of sense. Mitotic versus meiotic division, because it's not a stem cell, a cell that is nascent, meaning that a cell that is non-differentiated. Okay, moving right along. So we went over the different kinds of skin tissue or integumentary system more specifically, but we haven't really touched on like neurons, nervous system, nervous tissue, things like that. We did go over the different parts for the brain. So the pia mater is on the inside, the deepest part. Then we have the arachnoid, which is called that not because of spiders, but due to the fact that it spreads a lot more throughout the brain, and you can find it more readily. So when you get a subarachnoid hemorrhage or things like that, it's usually because the blood is actually literally spreading pretty fast. And then you also have subdural bleeding as well, meaning that it's underneath the dura, which is right above the arachnoid. So when you have a subarachnoid, it's above the pia mater, which is the most sensitive for the brain. Subdural, right above the arachnoid, which is not as sensitive but still can be dangerous because it can cause a hemorrhagic it could be a cause of it could be caused by a hemorrhagic stroke. That makes sense. But for nervous tissue, you think of a sheet of paper again. And you could think of neurons. So the neuron has the cell body, it has the axons, has the myelinated sheath, which covers over the message that is being sent biochemically, which becomes electricity, shooting down the axon hillock of the neuron. And as you can imagine, a neuron is not by itself. It's with helpers called glial cells, which you can read in your textbook. I'm not going to explain it now. It's also helped by oligodendrocytes. Usually helpful when nervous tissue is breaking down or just to support a message being sent. Nervous tissue, as opposed to epithelial cells, do not grow back willingly. They do not go through mitotic cell division willingly or voluntarily. They have to be forced under serious stimuli to be regrown. Usually pediatric patients, because their brain and their spinal cord are still plastic, meaning that it's still able to adapt to change. That is the reason why if you have a kid that lost half their brain, they can still function as if they were normal. It's due to the fact that some of the cells regrew, and now the new cells, along with the old ones, compensate for the lack thereof. That's the main thing you need to know about nervous tissue. The other thing is that nervous tissue is divided into whether it's made for a motor function, it's made for sensory function, somatosensory body sense, so somatosensory nerve cells, sensory motor, meaning that it's for when I touch a hot stove that I can take my hand back quickly, or it's just plain motor, so it's within the neuromuscular junction between like a muscle cell, for instance, and that's usually coming by continuous pumping of iron, as Gary did before, where you're voluntarily contracting your muscles. Make sense? Nervous tissue is also a fun fact. Like cable wires can insulate themselves, such as the spinal cord. It is self-insulating. However, it cannot protect itself. A lot of nervous tissue is not self-protecting. That's why you have your integumentary system. That's why you have your skeletal system, so on and so forth. Epithelial cells, however, can protect themselves. Also, you have cardiac tissue, which, similar to epithelial cells, protect the heart. But what's most important is that you go over each tissue type for your own understanding, because me telling you is not really going to do much, aside from the epithelial is skin. That's what you're going to be puncturing when you use a needle. You're going to have the subcutaneous level, you're going to have the epidermal layer, which is above the dermis. Then you're going to have the dermis, cutaneous, subcutaneous. You're going to have gland within the gland itself, the apical and the basal layers of epithelial tissue. And then you're going to have the fascia, which is right above muscle. And between all of that, obviously, are nerves and glands and so forth. Makes sense? So from there, for the integumentary system, all you really need to know is that your body needs it for absorption, excretion, filtration, that it's for protection for inner organs, as well as for the muscles, that it's used for cushioning as well. It's used for getting nutrients as well. It's used for thermoregulation as well, via sweating, via the pressure receptors, when you're deep in water as well. When you're in front of an AC, you're sweating, things like that. But all in all, aside from that, you just need to know that when a person is cyanotic, if you're light skinned, then it's easy to tell. But if you're of a darker complexion, use your mucosal lining, such as your lips, to be able to tell if you're adequately perfusing. The next thing that you really need to know is that skin is able to regrow, no matter how badly you damage it, unless you have a disease. Okay? Usually it's melanoma, form of cancer, or where the scar tissue just stays with you forever, but that means the body's still healing, so you still are getting new cells. It's just distributed a little bit differently due to the way that it's arranged. So usually your skin is lighter when you have a scar, once it's fully healed. The other things for the integumentary system is understanding how certain medications can flush your skin immediately due to the adrenaline-like effects, and how you can produce healthier skin by taking in vitamin A, vitamin D, and for hair follicles, keratin, and for your nail bed, keratin as well, and for just making sure for nutrition as well, so your skin naturally doesn't tent. For instance, that's a key thing. Also for the temple example he gave, your muscles don't waste away on their own. So if you see that your skin is caving in, it's not your skin, it's your muscles that are wasting away. That's something that he spoke about today. But aside from that, I hope you learn a little bit more, or it's a little bit more understandable and digestible. Alright, see you in the next one, guys.